whatever. Yuri bang, you know what's happened. Cool, so I'm conscious as well that we all want to get to the pub, so I'm going to keep it relatively simple. And hopefully it shouldn't be too long. There's loads of different avenues around with IPv6 security, extension headers, all that sort of stuff. But we're going to cover one quite specific part of security, and that's addressing strategy, and we'll sort of see why that is later on in the presentation. If you're looking at things like extension headers and all those sort of best practices, then if you actually look on the UK IPv6 Council's YouTube channel, there's some really good videos on there as well from some good speakers and all that sort of stuff. A little bit of background on me though. My original background's in threat intelligence, so that's proactively finding issues in networks, in organizations, and trying to basically secure those before they can be targeted. As always, with security presentations, there's a little caveat to the information, and that is this is just basically advice, right? You know your networks better than I do, so some of this stuff might be relevant, some of it might not be, but it's not gospel, so implement what you can. There we go. Sure. Just go this. Cool. So, what's the motivation for this talk? Basically, there's a few quotes that are pretty common in the security community that I've based this talk around. The first one is disable IPv6. Yeah, and that got everyone's attention as well. So this is a really common quote that you hear all the time in the security community. And that basically comes from the fact that we are often seen as the fun police, right? We are constantly pushing back against adoption and different advancements, and IPv6 is no different. And if you go and troll through Reddit or LinkedIn enough, basically it won't take too long until you find some sort of security professional saying, to deal with the risks of IPv6, we need to disable IPv6, which, as we know, is pretty difficult to do. And also it's just not valid advice, because how far do we take that? If a vulnerability comes out in an IPv4 implementation, do we go and disable IPv4? Do we take that even further and just disconnect ourselves from the internet altogether? So, as advice goes from a security point of view, we can't just keep disabling things. Okay. The next bit of advice, or quote that I see all the time, is IPsec is the primary security benefit in IPv6. Now, it is obviously a benefit, but as we know, it's no longer a requirement. And there's loads of other benefits as well that often get overlooked when we're looking at IPv6 networks. There's quite a lot of research that's gone into this as well. So this is directly from a piece of research, academic research. An IPv6 network is 14 times less likely to receive email spam than IPv4. Now, 90% of attacks still come from email phishing. So that's a huge benefit of an IPv6 network over IPv4. As well, if we're getting attacked over IPv6, if we place filters, network blocks, whatever else, then we're more likely to actually stop that malicious traffic when compared to implementing blocks on IPv4 network. And there's some research as well that's gone into collateral. So there's certain research as well that's actually looked at if we place blocks on IPv6 traffic, we're actually less likely to take out legitimate users as well. Cool. And then final quote as well, not necessarily IPv6 related, but you can't protect what you don't know. And this is basically the whole narrative of what this talk is about. All right. Lots of the issues that we see as an organization often stem from organizations not understanding their true IPv6 exposure, what their footprint is, and all this sort of stuff. So basically the idea is if you have a simple network, if you understand it, then you can better defend it. Right. And the idea, again, why we're coming from this addressing strategy is because every single attack starts with reconnaissance, right? Cyber attack kill chain lays out all the different stages of an attack you might face. Basically, the idea of reconnaissance is an attacker is going to find areas of oversight in your network. Things that you've overlooked, things that you've forgotten about, they're things that are going to get targeted. And basically, the idea is if we can stop attacks as far left of this kill chain as possible at the reconnaissance stage, there's less risk. If we let attacks progress to this far right-hand side, up into this response stage, that's where we start getting issues. That's where you start getting your execs involved. You start, getting all angry and all this sort of stuff. So if we can stop attacks at this reconnaissance stage, that's great. Now, I know this is easier said than done, but if we can build a network that is easy to understand, then obviously we can implement features to stop reconnaissance. And that's the whole idea of this talk. Right? So I think it's worth, before we break into reconnaissance in IPv6 and how that's done, is also looking at how it's done in IPv4 and looking at what we're working with. So obviously we've got our public IPv4 addresses. The strategy of performing reconnaissance against public IPv4 addresses, dead easy. We brute force, right? We just iterate through every single public IPv4 address. It's not pretty, but it does the job. And the going sort of figure of how fast you can do that is you can basically ping sweep the entire public IPv4 range in roughly 4 minutes. I've seen some claims we've actually managed to do it in less than that. Whether that's true or not, don't know, but 4 minutes is basically the going rate. And we basically know, as security professionals or as network engineers, that if we put services, attach them to public IPv4 addresses, make them routable out to the internet, they're going to get scanned with reconnaissance. And we should be in the keyword, account for that with access control lists, filters, all that sort of fun stuff. Quite a common strategy, I've seen this quite a few times now, is organizations go, well, rather than using the common ports, we're just going to dump whatever service is on some obscure port because nobody will find it there. Well, the tools are there. It's really easy to do this sort of stuff and your service is going to get found. Obviously with IPv4 as well, we've also got to talk about private IPv4 addresses. And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky from an external reconnaissance point of view because we've got NAT in the way. Right? And what NAT basically does is it hides that network topology. It has that little barrier in the way, and in a way acts as a layer of obscurity. But from an attacker's point of view, they are well aware of NAT. And there's loads of techniques out there to bypass NAT if you want to attack a network. So you can do port forwarding, bits of stuff you can do with DNS as well. And even then, we can actually get those devices that are sat behind NAT to communicate to us first. So that's where phishing comes in, that's where you can, Trojans, all that sort of stuff, supply chain compromise. There's loads of different techniques we can use to perform reconnaissance in IPv4. Right. Reconnaissance in IPv6. Again, common myth in the security community is that because of the address space, the size of the address space in IPv4 is not scanned. Not true, right? Active reconnaissance of the IPv6 address space is happening all the time. It's happening right now, it's probably happening against your networks right now. And what we've got is we've got loads of different sensors scattered around the internet, trying to replicate different services, different network architectures. And what we see is we see constant scanning against those different sensors we've got scattered about. And it's actually quite interesting how fast, if we set up a new sensor in a space that we don't believe has been used before, how fast probes actually start appearing against those sensors. So it's something we need to be aware of. But the scanning strategy in IPv6 is a little bit different. We saw before that we just brute force IPv4. Well, we can't really do that against IPv6 because, again, the address space is so big. And what this myth has sort of led to as well is sometimes people think just by deploying IPv6, we're secure. Not true. We still need to basically think about those filters and access control lists and all that sort of stuff. So what is IPv6 reconnaissance aiming to find? If we can't just brute force the address space, well, how do we actually start to find these assets, these little interesting bits of oversight? So that's where we're starting looking at common and predictable patterns. We're looking at basically networks that might have been forgotten about, which might not have filtering or access control and all that sort of stuff. And from an attacker's point of view, they get some benefits of IPv6, so you can constantly rotate your source IP address, which can sometimes get around network rules, rate limiting, and all that sort of stuff. Cool. So when we're performing reconnaissance against IPv6, there's basically two steps to it. If you've got this massive address space that is just the entire IPv6 address space, well, we need to reduce that down to a slightly smaller massive address space, and that is when we start looking at network prefixes and subnets, right? And basically the idea of this is we're just trying to reduce the scope of the space that we're trying to perform reconnaissance against. Relatively easy to do from an attacker's point of view. You can go and look at routing tables, you can do this by DNS, all sorts of stuff. And again, that reduces the space that we're trying to search down to areas that are basically active. The next stage is this is where we're starting to look for interface IDs. This is where we're starting to actually look for assets, what those assets might be, and where we can actually directly target them. Now, obviously, if we all followed best practices and current RFCs and everything like that, it should be pretty difficult to do. But we see that's often not the case. And there's been quite a lot of research around this as well. We've done our own probes and things like that to find out sort of how many legacy strategies are still in use. And it's roughly estimated that around 40% of last hop routers are still using legacy addressing strategies. And it actually goes a bit further than this as well. When you start looking at some of these routers, only 20% of them are basically updated monthly, which from an attacker's point of view is great, right? They're using an addressing strategy that they can go and identify. They know that quite often they're not updated often. And then, if you go and look at some of the vulnerabilities in routers, they're normally pretty bad, right? So yeah, that's something we could probably go and target. The next sort of strategy we've got when it comes to performing reconnaissance against IPv6 is targeting addressing strategies that are easy to remember. We see these all the time when we look at different organizations. People don't like remembering, the full length IPv6 address. So what do? They do different strategies to make it easier to remember what their addresses are. So low byte, again, not making use of the full prefix that you might allocate to an endpoint. Service exposing addresses, these are really common. From an attacker's point of view, if we see things where the address ends in 22, it's pretty easy to guess what service is probably sitting behind that IP address. And then words, things like that. And then aliasing, this often gets overlooked. So from an IPv6 point of view, we can allocate multiple addresses to that device. Or we can even allocate an entire subnet if we wanted to, which is again reducing the scope down from an attacker's point of view of how many probes you need to send into a network to find those active devices. And the rule of thumb, basically, is if an address is easy to remember, then it's also easy to find from an attacker's point of view. I've put this a little bit in as well. It's not necessarily a bad thing to use these strategies. Obviously, take that with a pinch of salt. As long as we implement filtering, access control lists, and the other necessary defenses to basically defend against them, like we would do in IPv4, right? So what's the underlying problem? Obviously, we've got this reconnaissance going on, and what's the actual issue? We find this quite often when we look at organizations' networks, is that IPv6 deployment started possibly 20 years ago, right? Some organizations started tinkering around with IPv6 a long time ago, probably using strategies back then that were best practice, but obviously aren't best practice now. So that makes it a little bit difficult. When we start to combine that with the fact that a lot of organizations have then expanded their IPv6 deployment or what they're doing without a consistent plan, it starts to get a little bit more confusing, right? There's conflicting strategies, different teams might have got involved, all this sort of stuff. And then, this is really common again from a network point of view, security is often an afterthought. See it all the time where people stand up these networks and they go, right, we're going to get all the networks set up first, we're going to make sure it's all working, and then we're going to add security on top. Reason being because there's less to debug if it doesn't work or all that sort of stuff. So we see that too. And what does that ultimately lead to? Well, from an attacker's point of view, it's great because there's areas of oversight that they can go and target. Right. So this is where we come back to IPv6, right? Now with IPv6, we've got a couple of features that are really useful that we can basically leverage to make our networks more secure. What we're going to do to hopefully make this a little bit less boring is we're going to take the idea from a fortress for this, right? Because a fortress has got all these different layers of defense, and we can do similar stuff in an IPv6 network. So now with a fortress, what we've got is we've basically got this big outside perimeter wall. We might have a moat, we might have it sat on a hill, whatever else. IPv6, normally your perimeter is more clearly defined than IPv4, unless you are an organization that has got some massive IPv4 allocation, at which point there's probably some people in this room who want to talk to you about that. You might have more clearly defined perimeter than IPv6, right? And that perimeter as well is probably using a continuous address space, which makes it more simple to create filtering rules, right? Because we're not thinking about all these different pockets of IPv4, we might have a continuous address space. I've put this on as well as a little bit of a bonus. It's not necessarily security related, But quite often when we talk about IPv6, nobody ever talks about what happens if you deplete your allocation that you get given, your initial allocation. We've said this to a couple of organizations. If you go and ask maybe your ISP, whoever else it is who allocates your prefixes, can they reserve the next adjacent space? Because if they do that and then you deplete your current allocation, then you can just roll into that continuous address space, which makes it still easier to implement those filtering rules and manage what you've got. So because we've got this, hopefully, more clearly defined perimeter, it means we can then start implementing rules on this network edge. We can do things like silently drop in unsolicited inbound traffic. Similar to how that might work. And I've emphasized the silent here because, again, there's been quite a lot of research into where organizations send back error messages. From an attacker's point of view, that's leaking information about your network. So if you can silently drop that traffic, that's better because it doesn't give away that information that might help an attacker to sort of tune what they're targeting for. And then you can obviously enforce, best practices, rate limits, whatever else on the network edge. And what else we've got with IPv6 is when we actually start to construct this network, we can do it in basically a hierarchy, right? And what that means is we can enforce rules higher up the network that then get filtered down onto everything else below it. And that's sort of a strategy that follows on once we're past the perimeter, right? We can carve out these different bits of our network into logical segments, whatever else, and we can start to group together assets, devices that have got similar things. So there's a couple of examples, and this got spoken about as well in a previous talk. Things like guest Wi-Fi, right? Can we group together all our guest devices? Payment card information, this is sometimes a real headache. Basically, if you read into the PCI documentation, it says that devices that handle payment card information shouldn't be directly interfacing with the internet. IPv4, you can do double NAT and things like that, which got spoken about before. IPv6, well, if we can group together all those devices into a single part of your network, it makes it a little bit easier to track and control what they're doing. And this again is really important. Quite often we forget about the monitoring part. So when we implement filters and access control lists, they're based on threats and use cases that we're aware of now. From an attacker's point of view, they're really good at getting around the filters, access control lists and stuff like that you've got in place. So how do we actually work to stop and spot those attacks that manage to get around the filters we've got in place? Well, we do that with monitoring, right? So each of these parts of the segment, implement monitoring, right? If part of your network suddenly has a massive increase in IPv6 traffic, why is that? If suddenly you have a massive reduction in IPv6 traffic, why is that? You shouldn't have to basically rely on your customers or maybe the third parties you deal with to say, hang on a minute, there's suddenly a drop in traffic or whatever else. Implement that monitoring to spot it. First stop security as well. So a little bit of work that we've done is we've been looking at how you can actually architect your network to spot reconnaissance that's happening in IPv6. Now we've done this in sort of like a lab environment. So whether this gets a bit more tricky to do in a production environment, basically what we were looking at was if you start to leave the first and last part of your allocation empty, what we were finding was we were seeing less reconnaissance because there's quite a lot of simple reconnaissance probers out there. But what they'll do is they'll send probes into the very start of a network prefix. They'll send probes into the end. And if they don't get any meaningful response back, they basically just jump onto whatever the next prefix is. They don't dig any deeper than that. So we've seen some promising results through that. And you can actually go further with this as well from an intelligence point of view. If you leave part of your allocation empty, then if you see traffic happening in that allocation, why is that? And that could be part of your network as well that you've maybe just not even started using yet. Still set up that monitoring because if there is traffic going on to that area, what's the reason for that? Can you then build filters based off that activity that defend the rest of the network? All that sort of stuff. And bringing this back down to the sort of the fortress analogy we're using, you observe the activity that's going on like a watchtower, and then you pull up the drawbridge when you're not happy with it. That's sort of what we're looking at, right? So going one step deeper than that, now we're starting to look at endpoints. And again, our fortress analogy, endpoints being those rooms in your fortress, right? You've not just got open doors, you've got massive big wooden doors, you've got massive big locks, all that sort of stuff. Same with our endpoints, right? When you're sat in one of those rooms in your fortress, somebody comes, knocks on the door, knock, knock, you go, who's there, right? You don't just open the door or anything like that. So this is where, again, from our endpoints points of view, there's some different strategies we can employ. Using RFCs and things like that, temporary addresses, privacy addresses to help defend your endpoints. Really common strategy from an attacker's point of view. Even if you maybe pick some random address out of a /64 and think, well, we're not using low byte, whatever else. From an attacker's point of view, if you go and reach out to maybe an external service, browse to certain sites, you're leaking information about what your IP address is. So that's why using things like privacy addresses and stuff like that are pretty important. Defense in depth gets spoken about all the time. Now, from a cybersecurity point of view, there are absolutely hundreds of acronyms, right? Especially when we start getting to endpoint security. So there's a couple listed on there. Now, whatever acronym you choose to use when it comes to endpoint security, make sure it actually properly supports IPv6. It's quite common for security providers to say, yeah, we support IPv6, but not to all the different address types or different lifetimes that are available. Certain organizations as well might turn around and say, well, our upstream provider doesn't offer IPv6. Doesn't mean your endpoints aren't using IPv6. So if you've got that endpoint security there, make sure it's actually looking at these different types of addresses that exist in IPv6. And then again, really simple one, right? Local firewalls often get forgotten about. They're either disabled or sometimes they've got default configurations. Is there anything you can do there? And I've put a note on this as well. This is especially important if you're using those easy to remember addressing strategies we mentioned earlier on. Again, it's just all building towards that defense in depth. So let's start wrapping this up so we can start going to the pub. So we've spoken a little bit there about reconnaissance, addressing strategy and things like that. And I think this is a common theme throughout the whole of today. It's basically spend time planning your IPv6 networks, right? What's the actual strategy? How are you going to expand that IPv6 network? And make sure you embed security from the start, or at least have a plan to embed security or where you're going to add it, right? Something I've been probably quite quiet on over this presentation is cloud. There's a good reason for that is because we could have spoken for well over half an hour about cloud security when it comes to IPv6. There's loads of different strategies there. But also there's another reason as well, is that when we actually start looking at clouds and the service offerings, over the past couple of years, cloud providers have done loads of work, right? And that's absolutely brilliant. But when it comes to the security offerings they've got, quite often they are not at the same level as we can do when it comes to on-prem. So when you're an organization, you're thinking about deploying IPv6, make sure you go and look what security solutions are available in cloud, because often that's a blocker, and basically demand that cloud service providers either offer those same solutions to what we can get on-prem, or make sure they've actually got it in a roadmap at least. And then the next part of the summary as well is changing this narrative. The IPv6 is basically a security burden to a security opportunity. Hopefully we've seen a little bit through this that there are security benefits of IPv6, right? And we need to get away from this narrative of disabling IPv6 to deal with the security risks. And basically we saw the impact of this narrative back in August. So back in August there was a vulnerability that came out, and it's up to debate as to whether that vulnerability was directly related to IPv6 or not. But very quickly, lots of security professionals jumped on the back of that vulnerability and said that the mitigation to it was to disable IPv6, when that wasn't even the accepted mitigation. And basically what we saw off the back of that is this is Google's IPv6 stats, is that we actually saw a decrease in the usage of IPv6. So on the 14th of August was when the vulnerability was released. And we actually saw a decrease off the back of that. So was that related to the narrative of disabling IPv6 based off something that wasn't even the real mitigation? That's basically something we need to get ahead of, because if more vulnerabilities keep coming out that are in some way or another vaguely related to IPv6, then that narrative might take over and impact the overall deployment of IPv6. Cool. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour about addressing strategy, reconnaissance, things like that. We have got a LinkedIn page, we've got a blog, so we're going to break into a bit more of this stuff over the next couple of weeks as well. But yeah, give it a follow, and yeah, any questions? That's either a really good thing or a really bad thing. So, yeah.
Well, this was excellent. Thank you so much, David, for giving us a slightly different view from the traditional IPv6 security presentations, which typically are just scaring everybody, you know. And like this
That's the idea anyway. That was the idea behind it. Yeah, rather than coming in with the scary mode.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah,
Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you.